Okay, Be'ezras Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zevachim, number 35, Lamed Hey. And we're starting from daf Lamed Dalet on the base, four lines, 5 lines from the bottom. Just as a picture, very easy Gemara. Um, if you remember the Mishnayos and Psachim, the way they used to, they had the first forward assembly line when on Erev Pesach, every Jew brought his carbon Pesach. So they had an assembly line with a slaughterer, and then somebody, kohen, catches the blood, passes the vessel that he caught the blood to the next kohen, who passed it to the next kohen, to the next kohen, as you can see in the picture, and then was eventually sprinkled with one sprinkle on the mizbeach, and then they passed the empty vessel back. And this was an assembly line in order to facilitate the thousands and thousands of people bringing a carbon pesach in the afternoon, and they had to get this done before nightfall. So this is how it was done. Eventually, some of the blood ends up on the floor. Somebody misses the blood that's supposed to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. As you can see, they sprinkled one on the mizbeach. So, and actually, they brought the limbs of the carbon on the mizbeach, and then you brought the animal home to roast, right? So what they did was, the Mishnah says, during that time they clogged all the drains in the Azara. They clogged the drains, and basically the whole area filled up with blood. The whole area filled up with blood. So imagine that there was a lot of blood there, and so therefore, why did they do that? So we're going to see over here a teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, why they did that. So here we go. Gufa, we learned before. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. They clogged up all the drains. Rabbi Yehuda said, then they would take kois echad hoyibamale midama taravis. Then they would fill up one cup from all those bloods that are on the floor. Okay, they would fill up one cup. Sh'im, because the possibility was shim yishafech echad mehem, if somebody who slaughtered his carbon pesach, somehow his blood fell on the floor, so and it never made it to the mizbeach. So if you fill it up from at the end, you just make one refill. Somebody whose blood never made it to the mizbeach was in that cup, and they nimtza shehu machshira, that will make his carbon kosher. So this was like a backup plan, just in case one of the bloods dropped on the floor. They would fill up a cup of blood from all the blood in the pool of blood that was on the floor, and then bring it to the mizbeach. Presumably, the ones, that unfortunate guy that didn't have his carbon, onto the blood onto the mizbeach, they got it by refilling it at the end. Amru loy. So, but the Chachamim have a problem with that. Amru loy Rabbi Yehuda v'loy niskabel b'kli. Maybe the blood that was on the floor never made it into a vessel. It's blood that came from an animal that dropped directly onto the floor. And we know that if blood that never made it into a vessel cannot be sprinkled on the mizbeach. In fact, you get an avera, sprinkling puzzle of blood on the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, "Mino yadi." The Gemara interrupts the question. How did the Chachamim know that maybe it was blood that's on the floor that did not make it into a vessel? Ella, the Gemara says, "Shema lo niskabel b'kli." What the problem is, no, they didn't know for sure, but maybe some of the blood that's on the floor was blood that never made it into a vessel. Amar lehen. So Amar lehen. So Rabbi Yehuda responded, "You're right. You're not supposed to sprinkle blood that never made it into a vessel onto the mizbeach, but we go to Lamahei Lam Aleph, af ani lo yamarti, I didn't say that, ella, an afani el kabel b'kli. I was only talking about the blood that's on the floor. All the blood that made it onto the floor, according to Rabbi Yehuda, was blood that was at one time in a vessel. So all this blood that you're going to see on the floor here was all probably from all these Kehanim that had this, and it dropped from the vessel onto the floor. That's what the Gemara is saying right now. Says the Gemara, "Who gufa minalei minayada?" How did Rabbi Yehuda know that? And says the Gemara, Kahanim's reason, Kahanim are very diligent. Va'avdin haya, they do it very fast. They were doing it so fast, they spilled it on the floor, but really it came from a vessel. And therefore, since it was once in a vessel, you could sprinkle it on the mizbeach. Says the Gemara, but not every blood that's on the floor was blood that was once in a vessel. But there's blood, it's, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, blood of exudate that's mixed in there. In other words, the only blood that is allowed to be sprinkled on the mizbeach is blood when you first shech the animal, the blood that first comes out, the first like couple of minutes, the blood's coming out, that's the blood that the life of the animal is dependent on. Here, but there's blood that comes from tendon, from capillaries and other types of blood. That's just blood that just oozes out of the animal. That certainly is not supposed to be brought onto the mizbeach. And most of the blood that's on the floor is blood that you cannot sprinkle on the mizbeach. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Tameh. Rabbi Yehuda will go according to his opinion. The Amad Dam Tansis Karidam. That blood, even though it's not the blood, the main blood of the animal that the life of the animal is dependent on, is still called blood. And therefore, if you eat it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you would get the death penalty. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Dam HaTamtzes Ba'azara. The Tanakama holds if you eat this Dam HaTamtzes, you only get a lav. Rabbi Yehuda says it's bekaris, you get karis. So therefore, since Rabbi Yehuda holds Dam HaTamtzes is the same as regular Dam HaNefesh, and therefore it could be sprinkled on the Mizbeach. Says the Gemara, not true. Well, Amar Rab Lazar says, Moidu Rabbi Yehuda le'inyan kapara she'ena mechaper. Rabbi Yehuda agrees that although if you eat this dam, the blood that comes from capillaries, right, it's dam hatamtzus, you get kares, but you can't use that for blood to sprinkle on the mizbeach. You have to use the blood that first comes out after the slaughtering, that first blood, because le'inyan kapara she'ena mechaper. That's not good blood to be used on the mizbeach, because the pasuk says, Ki damu never dam shanefesh yotzeba koridam. She'ein hanefesh yotzeba ein koridam. The blood that the soul of the animal leaves it, that's called the blood that you sprinkle on the mizbeach. But the blood that's not dependent, that's not what the life of the animal depends on, that's not called blood that's sprinkled on the mizbeach. The question is, even if, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're going to stop picking up blood off the floor, most of the blood comes from blood from the animal that's not supposed to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. So how did Rabbi Yehuda say you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach? Says the Gemara, El Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei. Rabbi Yehuda goes according to his reasoning. The Amma who said ein dam mevatel dam, which means that true, most of the blood is called dam tamtzis, but there is a little dam hanefesh from people who did not have their dam hanefesh brought on the mizbeach. So you pick up all the blood. And we're going to assume that the dam hanefesh is still there because even though most of it is dam hatamtzis, blood will not nullify other blood. So it's not batel barov. So there's still dam hanefesh in that cup of mixture that you picked up, and therefore you could sprinkle it on the mizbeach. You might be sprinkling dam tamtzis on the mizbeach. So that we'll look at the tamtzis as you're thinking that the dam tamtzis that you're going to sprinkle on the mizbeach, that's water or something like that, or if dam nefesh mixes with dam tamtzis, it's still kosher to be brought on the mizbeach. So it's not going to be such a problem. So again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, let's review. Rabbi Yehuda said, and this was a custom in the temple on Erev Pesach, they would stuff all the drains up, and there's blood filling up. And why did they do that? According to Rabbi Yehuda, on the floor of the Mizbeach, because so that we can take one extra cup and throw the blood on the Mizbeach, just in case somebody's blood from his carbon ended up on the floor and was never brought on the Mizbeach. So we try to fix that problem by having one cup of this blood mixture and throwing it onto Mizbeach. So now the question is, according to Rabbanim, that they didn't do that. Then why was the custom in the temple to close all the drains on Erev Pesach? Rabbi Yehuda, why did they close up all the drains in the Azara? It really made things messy. Can you imagine? There's a flood, whenever there's a heavy rainstorm and the water doesn't go down, and you're walking in a pool of blood of water, it's not nice. It's inconvenient. So how are the Kahanim walking now in blood? Amru Lois Chacham said that's the point. Shevachu levnei Aharon. This was a great praise for the bnei Aharon. Shehalchu ad al krubehem bedam. They would walk in their ankles or their knees in blood. And this was, they're busy in the blood, and therefore it showed that, they're busy on being makar of karbonos, of the carbon pesach. So that's why they did it. That they wanted the Khan to get down and dirty. Says the Gemara, Dam, it's a very big problem. Dam have a Remember, the Kahanim walked barefoot in the Beis Hamikdash, and they're stepping not on the floor, but they're stepping on the blood. Isn't that a chatzitza, an interruption between their soles of their feet and the floor of the Beis Hamikdash? And says the Gemara, Lahu, it was liquid blood. It didn't dry. But like have a chatzitza, that's not called an interruption. Then and they're not makbid. A chatzitza is something that you're concerned about, but they're not concerned about. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Hadam, Badyoy, Vadvash, Vachol, all these things, these liquids that could potentially dry, like blood, ink, honey, and milk. Yavation, if they're dry, chaitzes, and they're an interruption. Lachim, but if they're still in their liquid form, ein chaitzes, they're not chatzitza. So we don't have a problem with the chatzitza if the kahanim are walking in blood. But there is another problem. But their clothing will get dirty. And so what if the kain's clothing gets full of blood? Utnan, we learned in the Mishnah, the Kohen has dirty clothing with mud on it, let's say, and he did the service, his service is rendered invalid. So how could they do service on carrying the blood to the Mizbeach, sprinkling when they have dirty clothing full of blood? Do you say the madal they rolled up their pants so that it doesn't get dirty, and therefore they walked in their knees in blood, but their pants were rolled up. Well, Tanya, we learned in the Brisa they're not allowed to roll it up. Mida, kimi side. It has to be his side. He's not allowed to roll it up. Answers the Gemara, you're right. They got dirty. They did services that brought the limbs to the ramp, which is not really a service. So there you could bring it with dirty clothing. Says the Gemara of Allah, Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, the pasuk seems to describe bringing the limbs of the animal, of the sheep, to be brought onto the mizbeach. That is a service. So again, it's not supposed to be done with dirty clothing. So why did they allow the kahanim's clothing to get dirty? Ella, when the kahanim were bringing wood to the Mizbeach, they brought it from a closet outside of the Azara, and they brought it into the Mizbeach to put extra wood onto the Mizbeach. That's not a service, a regular service, and therefore it could be done with dirty clothing. But the Gemara says, but at the end of the day, a lot of the Kahanim are doing the service. They're doing the Kabbalah, and by passing it to the other Kahanim, they're doing halacha, right? And all this is halacha. If you tell me that all this floor was full of blood and the kahanim's clothing got dirty, right? So then the whole avodah was puzzle. How did they get around that? Answers the Gemara, Azlu it's dabi. They would, I guess, walk on platform raised above the floor so that the blood would not reach their clothing. In other words, this picture is not correct because according to the Gemara, they had like a platform over here, somehow a platform that was connected to the ground, so it's not a chetzitza, and yet there was a lot of blood that they could see that was on the floor because of all the karbonos that were brought for the Erev Pesach. New Mishnah. Hashoichet es zevach. Someone slaughters a korban. Lechel dover shendakol lechel. He had a bad thought on let's introduce. And a regular typical carbon, let's say a carbon shlamim, the meat you eat, right? The meat you eat, and part of the animal, the innards, you burn on the mizbeach. So what happens? So if you have a psul, if you have a bad thought that you can do everything in the wrong place or the wrong time, on these. If you have that bad thought while you're shechting the carbon, you invalidate the carbon. But the Mishnah says, "Hashoichet as a zevach, you shech the carbon lechol dovash ein darke lechol." To eat something that you're not supposed to eat. Let's say he has a bad thought that he's going to eat the innards that are supposed to be brought on the mizbeach. He says, "I'm going to eat those innards in 3 days from now." Or if he says, I'm gonna bring on the mizbeach in 3 days from now the meat. Well, that's not supposed to be brought on the mizbeach. That's supposed to be eaten. So kosher, that's not an invalid thought, and that will not make the carbon piggle. Rabbi Lezer paisa. Rabbi Lezer says it does make it piggle, even though you're mixing it up. Chutz lizmane and chutz l'mekaymai should be on the food. You're saying to yourself, the food that I'm going to eat 3 days from now, and the stuff that I'm going to be brought on the mizbeach, I'm going to bring it in 3 days from now. But if I reverse it and say I'm going to eat the innards that are supposed to be brought on the mizbeach, according to the Tanakama, it's not pasul, and according to Rabbi Lezer, it is pigel. Lechel shadaka lechel hakta davish hakta pachas mikazayis. If I says I'm going to eat this animal, but a half a zayis I'm going to eat in 3 days from now, so then kosher. Then it's kosher. You didn't invalidate the carbon. It's not pigel. Lechel kachatzi zayis lahakta kachatzi zayis. Let's say I said I'm going to eat a half a zayis of this animal of the meat 3 days from now. And another half of zayis, I'm going to be of the Amorim, I'm going to be maktir, I'm going to bring on the Mizbeach in 3 days from now. So kosher, the animal's kosher. She'ein achilu v'aktar mitzdarfen. These two different bad thoughts don't combine. One is, so what is a bad thought? What is a piggle thought? Clear. A man thinks that he's going to eat the meat of the carbon, chutz lizmanei or chutz l'mekaymai, not in the right place, not in the right time. That is a bad thought, and it has to be a kazayas. Or a man thinks that he's going to be makter, what's supposed to be makter on the mizbeach, at the wrong time. He says, I'm going to makter it on the mizbeach, I'm going to bring it onto the mizbeach in 3 days from now. So there, that passes the carbon. What happens, says the Mishnah, hashoichet es hazavach, someone sech the carbon, lechel kazayas min or min aroitiv umin akipa. He says he's going to eat of the inedible parts of the animal. Like the skin, the hide of the animal, or the gravy of the animal, or from spices with little pieces of meat at the bottom of the stew, which is there's no kazayas there. Umin ha'olol, or he sees a mount of from a tendon in the neck. Umin ha'tzamas, from the bones. Umin ha'gidem, or from the tendons. Or min karnaim, or from the horns, or min telefayim, or from the hooves. So he's saying that basically, I'm going to eat these hooves. Let's say, let's give the hooves or the horns. I'm going to eat the horns. Chutz l'zman and chutz l'mekaymai. That was his thinking when he shechted the animal. I'm thinking that these hooves I'm going to eat. Chutz l'zman and chutz. You don't eat hooves. Kosher, the animal's kosher. There's no such a thing that if the animal's piggle because you thought that you're going to eat the meat in the chutz l'zmani, the karnayim, the horns, never become piggle. The noiser, and if you left over the animal, the horns don't. The horns, the hooves, do not become noiser. The tame, and if you are tame, you can eat these things. The karnayim, you don't get that avera. Hashoichet, now the Mishnah says, Hashoichet es hamukdashim. Someone says shechsa carbon. Lechel sholil or shilya. He's going to eat the embryo or the sac that the embryo is in, bachutz, outside. Loy pigel, he didn't violate the carbon. Okay, we're going to discuss this piece in the Gemara. Hamoilik es a someone who cuts the birds. The kohen that cuts the birds it wasn't shchita by birds. They did malika with the fingernail. But he says, lechel es b'tzeim b'chutz. He's in mind to eat the eggs inside the bird, outside the Beis Hamikdash, or outside Yerushalayim. Loy pigel did not make the carbon pigel. Chalev mikdashim ubeitzi tayrim ein chayalim mishum pigel v'noisov tamid. The milk. Let's say you slaughtered an animal and made it pigel, right? Or the bird is pigel because of the meat. Rather, the bird, you thought a bad thought. What about the milk inside the animal, inside the breast of the animal, or the eggs that didn't come out yet? Those you're not liable of pigel, nois, and tamei. Those are not included in the Isser pigel. Again, once an animal, a carbon becomes pigel, only the meat and the edible stuff become pigel. A part of the animal that's not edible doesn't have that isser of pigel on it, and therefore, if you would eat it, you wouldn't get kares. Now, there's I talked about in the Mishnah of edible parts and non-edible parts. What about a part of the animal that's edible only b'shasat chak? Some people eat it, but most people don't. So Amar Rab Lazar says that's the chiddush. Pigel bezevach nispagel hasholil, b'sholil lo nispagel zeh. If the meat of the animal became pegel, then the embryo became pigel. Beshalil, but if you thought of just violating the embryo, lo nispagel hazevach, then the carbon didn't become possible. Same idea. Pigel ba'olo, if you thought about certain part of tendon that's edible, nispagel mur'ah, then the crop becomes possible. I have this picture over here, which is, here's the olol, which is edible. So then the zefek becomes pigel. If you have a mind that you're going to eat this pigel, this becomes pigel. But nispagal bemura, like nispagal kar. If you just think about the crop, then the rest of the olol does not become pigel. Pigel be'emerim. Let's say you mafagel the emerim, the one that's brought onto the mizbeach, nisbagal aparim. Then the cow that was supposed to be burnt. There's certain cows, param and nisrafim, that are supposed to be not even brought on the mizbeach, and not eaten. You just burn it totally, completely outside the base of English. So we discussed a couple of carbonates like that. So if you mafagel the emerim, then the parim become parim, which is not really edible because you're supposed to burn it. So if you made that pigel, loy nispagel emerim, the emerim didn't become pigel. So lema mesaile. So let us bring a proof to what Rabbi Lezer just said. Rabbi Lezer said that pigel be'emerim, if the carbon became pogel, these, shaky parts will also become pigel. Because the Brisa says, V'shavim, everybody agrees, by a param hanisrafim, shemchisha b'achilas rafim v'sarivasam lo yasol klum. If you had a mind, a bad thought by the parim, by the cow, and the burning, you didn't make it pigel. However, my love, doesn't this Brisa imply, hachisha be'emrim, if you thought about the emerim on this cow, nispaglu haparim, then the cow itself became pigel. Exactly what Rabbi Lezer said. Pigel be'emrim, nispaglu b'parim. Even though parim is something that's, not eaten, it's not shayach pigel on that because it's not eaten, it's supposed to be burnt. But nevertheless, and it's not eaten by the mizbeach, but nevertheless, pigel be'emrim, nispaglu parim. So this is exactly what Rabbi Lezer said. So that's a proof. Answers the Gemara, no, it's not such a proof. We go to Ramad Beis. If you think about the Amrim, Nispaglun Amim Asma, that's what we die. That if you think about the Amrim, then by these Param and Esrafim, only the Amrim become pigel, but the cow itself, since it's not an edible thing, it does not become pigel. Tashma, come in here. Parim hanisrafim esrimun asrafim alim behem mishahugdishu nishchatu. A param that's supposed to be burnt. Once it gets geschachten, hochshurely possible to v'yayim b'kusa kiparim uvelina. Once a param that's supposed to be burnt, right? That's called param hanisrafim. Is once it's slaughtered, then it can be possible with if it overnighted, if you delayed it and did not do what you're supposed to do with it overnight, then it becomes possible. My love, we're talking about linas basa, the meat. You didn't do anything with it, then it becomes possible lina. Ushmamina, miga de possible lina, possible makshava. Then, therefore, a bad thought could also destroy the animal, destroy the validity of the animal. So what you see from there is that if you think about the Amorim, you could passel the basar, and so we see that the basar has a possibility of becoming pigel via the Amorim. Exactly what Rabbi Elazar said. So this would be a proof to Rabbi Elazar. Answers the Gemara, loy linas Amorim. Only lina that we're talking about over here is only the Amorim. If the Amorim is, since that's part that's brought in the mizbeach, that's the only part that could become pigel. That's what the brisa means. The Gemara asks, but how could you say that this lina refers to the Amrim? The end of the brisa over there refers to basar, so it must be the beginning of the brisa also refers to basar. And says the Gemara, how do you know? Who says so? So again, let us review. Rabbi Eliezer made a chiddush over here, and he said that there's some parts of the animal, let us say, there's some parts of the animal, let's say the embryo. Nobody eats the embryo unless they're desperate. So if the embryo itself, if you have a pigul thought on the embryo, the rest of the animal is kosher. But Rabbi Eliezer said, if you have a pigul thought on the rest of the animal, then the embryo becomes pasul. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer said. Unlike an unedible part of the animal, let's say the horns, if you have a pigul thought on the animal, the horns don't become pigul. But here, by embryos, since it can be eaten, so it could become a pigul thought. So the Gemara asks one question. Moisiv Rava asks a question. Let's say the embryo and the sac. They can never become pigul. My love, this brisa seems to say that these parts, the embryo, can never become pigul, even if the rest of the animal is pigul. This is not going to be pigul. Answers the Gemara, they don't become pigul if they can't invalidate the animal if you have a pigul thought in the embryo, and if you just have a pigul thought in the embryo itself will not become pigul. That's what the brisa means. Why does the Mishnah repeat it? Why does the brisa repeat itself? So it must be, it's telling you that even if the zevach became pigul, this will not become pigul. So that's not true. Even though there are extra words in the brisa is it's on its own. It's just telling you that if you have a bad thought on the embryo, then nothing becomes pigul. But you could still maintain that if you have a bad thought on the rest of the animal, then the embryo would become pasul. So concludes the Gemara. You can really see this in the Mishnah. If you have a shechted carbon to eat the embryo of the sac outside, loy pigul. You didn't make it pigul because the embryo itself will not become pigul. The milk, the Mishnah says, the milk or the eggs will never become pigul, even if the rest of the animal became pigul, they'll not become pigul. Hashilya v'shilya, but we could imply from the Mishnah that the embryo and the sac, if the rest of the animal became pigul, they would become pigul. Chayavim. Alav shmamina, well, let's get it clear. If the rest of the animal became pigul, then the embryo and the sac would become pigul. But if you're just making this embryo pigul, like the brisa, then it would not become pigul. Shmamina. But so that's the din with the embryo, because those things can be eaten b'shas adchak. However, very clear, if the animal becomes pigul, the part of the animal that's unedible, like the hoof of the animal, the horns of the animal, they'll never become pigul. Okay, let's stop over here. Okay, good night.
Well, thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.